This is part 4 of the Ontario Hazelnut Ipm workshop series for 2021, Other Hazelnut Diseases. My name is Melanie Filitas and I am a horticulture integrated pest management specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. Throughout this series, we will be discussing a number of pest problems common to Ontario hazelnut orchards, including their identification, biology, how to monitor for them, as well as some general management practices. For general information on hazelnut scouting and where you can find additional information, refer to part 1 of this webinar series, Introduction to Hazelnut IPM. Parts 2 and 3 of this webinar series covered Eastern Filbert blight, a fungal disease, and bacterial blight in Ontario hazelnuts, and those are by far the most important pathogens that Ontario hazelnut growers will have to deal with. They tend to cause the most branch dryback and tree mortality in Ontario. However, there are a number of other diseases that you might encounter. So we're going to talk a little bit about those today so that growers can identify them, distinguish them from other problems, and know the relative impact to expect on their trees. The first disease that I would like to talk about is one that does appear fairly frequently in hazelnuts, and that is powdery mildew. It's caused by a fungus called Phylactinia guttata. This is a different species than the one you might be familiar with from apple or other horticultural crops in Ontario, but it is found in a number of hardwood tree species, including tree nuts. This species overwinters in fallen leaves and tree debris, and then the spores are spread into the orchard on wind currents. So unlike the powdery mildews of many of the more common fruit crops such as apples, where you get season-long defoliation starting in the spring, powdery mildew on hazelnuts typically does not appear until later into August. And then it will spread through the orchards, and by the end of August, it's not uncommon to find 40 to 60% of trees having some evidence of powdery mildew on the leaves. However, these symptoms are typically quite mild, and they are restricted to the leaves. They do not seem to spread to the nuts, and they don't seem to cause enough defoliation of the leaves that control is required. So to date, we have never had an instance where powdery mildew needs to be controlled in Ontario hazelnuts, but it definitely is present, and so growers should be aware of it. So in hazelnuts, powdery mildew typically appears as these circular, powdery, white, fuzzy patches, and they're typically concentrated on the underside of the hazelnut leaf. That's for hazelnuts specifically, and other crops you might see it on the upper portion of the leaf. So those patches can coalesce to completely cover the leaf with a white powdery growth, but that growth can be faint on hazelnuts, and it can initially, it may not pop out to the untrained eye. So if you look at the photo on the right, this upper leaf here is covered in a sort of a faint white fuzzy growth. That is powdery mildew as compared to the leaf underneath that is healthy, that does not have powdery mildew. So on occasion, later in the season with an older infection, you may also see some black fruiting bodies within the white growth on the underside of the leaf. But as I mentioned earlier, that is typically constrained to the leaf. It doesn't spread to the nuts. And to date, we have never seen a situation where powdery mildew in hazelnuts requires control. Next, I'm going to touch on root rots and wet feet. I've combined these together because they are interrelated. Both are issues that occur in hazelnut orchards that are produced under poor soil conditions. So where hazelnuts are produced in heavier soils or soils that tend to become more waterlogged, this is where you tend to see these issues. Root rots, mainly due to Phytophthora, have been reported in hazelnuts in other regions, although we have not yet diagnosed them in Ontario hazelnuts. But Phytophthora is a very common soil-borne pathogen that in Ontario is known to attack the roots of many species and can be a serious problem in some of our horticultural crops. However, in hazelnuts, or in most hazelnut growing regions of the world, Phytophthora has reported to be problematic only in very heavy wet soils or soils that have prolonged wet periods. Phytophthora and other soil-borne pathogens that are related to it require very wet conditions to produce spores, and they are able to make these specialized spores that swim through soil, through pores that are filled with water. That's really necessary for their movement. So where you create waterlogged soil conditions or areas where there's a lot of wet soil for prolonged periods, that gives these pathogens time to produce these spores, move through the soil, and infect the roots. Where hazelnuts are grown in ideal soil that is not overly wet, these pathogens really do tend to be less of a problem. That's not to say that you would never see them in hazelnuts grown in ideal soil, but it's important to be aware that if you're pushing your hazelnut production into a heavier soil, a soil where you do see water standing in the field for prolonged periods, then it's important to keep in mind that you may encounter problems with Phytophthora in the roots. So what sort of things would you be looking for? Again, yellowed foliage or leaf dieback, and that's because the roots are damaged and you get some reduced nutrient uptake to the upper portions of the tree. So where you're seeing leaf dieback, you've ruled out cankers from Filbert blight, you've ruled out bacterial blight, or you have bacterial blight, but it's really, really more severe than in other areas, then you might want to look to the roots. Roots, crowns, and cambium infected with Phytophthora may be discolored, and removing the bark, as in this center photo here, you may see some dark oozy tissue underneath the bark. So we do see dark oozy tissue with bacterial blight or with certain other canker diseases, but in the case of Phytophthora, you would see that oozing and that dark discolored tissue extending down towards the roots, which is where the infection initiated, instead of going up from that oozy area. So these ones are really important to be aware of because we have nothing currently registered in Ontario to control root rot. So once you have a root rot, you're stuck with it. So the best way to avoid it is to try to keep the hazelnuts as healthy as possible and locate them in fields that can drain and that don't stay wet for prolonged periods. So wet feet is a general term that is used to refer to hazelnut trees grown in saturated soil. It's a related condition and it's actually an abiotic disorder, and I'll be discussing abiotic disorders in a different webinar, but I wanted to mention it here because it overlaps so much with Phytophthora. So growing hazelnuts in saturated soil, they will grow. You will get a hazelnut orchard there. But bear in mind that where the soil is really waterlogged, those roots are deprived of oxygen. And so, or at least they're routinely deprived of oxygen when they're wet. So even if you don't get pathogens like Phytophthora, the roots are going to not be getting enough oxygen in there. They're going to grow slowly, and they're going to lead to stunting compared to trees in better drained soil. So you'll have in the lower areas of the orchard where it's not draining as well, it's not uncommon for the trees to be much more stunted, for yield to be reduced, and for them to be much more susceptible to pathogens. So that's where that Phytophthora comes in. So number one, the trees are a little bit weaker. Number two, there's more potential for Phytophthora spores to be moving in, so they can be infected with Phytophthora, but they're also weaker, so they're more susceptible to things like bacterial blight and other diseases. So those stunted trees may persist for years, producing nuts, but maybe not as many nuts, before they ultimately die. Hazelnut trees that are grown, though, even under good soil conditions, are susceptible to pathogens. We've already talked about eastern filbert blight, which produces cankers that are characterized by these raised stromata, but there are other fungal diseases that can cause cankers in hazelnut trees. Those of you who are reading material from the West Coast and other areas may be hearing about other canker fungi, so we're going to touch on those here. So in British Columbia in particular, but also in Oregon, they have found dying hazelnut trees that have cankers. That cankers were not due to bacterial blight or eastern filbert blight, and laboratory diagnostics showed various fungal pathogens, including Phomopsis, Diplodia, and Botryosphaeria. So in Ontario, we found Botryosphaeria quite commonly in conjunction with bacterial blight. We have also on occasion found Phomopsis. We don't know if those diseases came in after the bacterial blight got there and they invaded in there. We suspect that might be the case because we find bacterial blight far more commonly, and then we do find Botryosphaeria after the fact, but we have yet to find Botryosphaeria alone, but we don't know for sure. In general, though, where you get these cankers, you have really variable symptoms. You get these brown to dark cankers or lesions on the trunk, so similar to bacterial blight. Unlike filbert blight, you will not see those raised bumps or those raised stromata, but what you will still get branch dieback. They can cause delayed bud break. Overall, they can reduce your nut production, they can stunt your leaves, they can stunt the growth of the plants. but they're very, very difficult to identify without laboratory confirmation. So essentially where you are seeing cankers and you know it's not Eastern Filbert blight, you have ruled out bacterial blight, that might be the time to get a sample and submit it to a lab for laboratory confirmation. In British Columbia, there have been considerable issues with some canker fungi. Oregon, they are seeing some increasing numbers of these pathogens, but they're not really sure why. There are a few theories. Some theories suggest that reduced fungicide use due to a shift to Eastern Filbert blight resistant varieties is allowing these other fungi to come in, and they're not being controlled by fungicides that used to be sprayed a lot. Another theory is just that hazelnut production is being pushed to suboptimal sites, and that makes them more susceptible to invasion by these sort of opportunistic pathogens that might not otherwise invade. So as I mentioned, we haven't really seen these very much in Ontario, so we don't know if that's going to be a significant problem, but for now, really the best thing to do is to make sure that you keep your hazelnut trees as healthy as possible, growing them under good conditions and controlling all other pests to prevent wounds or other things where opportunistic pathogens can invade. Now I want to touch on decay fungi, mosses, and lichens. So these are all things that are not primary problems on hazelnut trees, but they are quite noticeable and they can be quite concerning if you initially see them and don't know what they are. Mosses and lichens are very, very common on hardwood trees. We are starting to see them in Ontario hazelnut orchards, but they are far more common in other hazelnut growing regions where they have very mature hazelnut orchards, and we certainly see them on other fruit crops and landscape trees in Ontario. So lichen are structures that are demonstrated in the two photos on the right. So they are basically, they do look a bit mold-like, and what they actually are a fungus and an algae living symbiotically on the bark of the tree. Mosses are a kind of vascular plant that produce spores. And this is a photo from a hazelnut orchard in Ontario. It's completely covered in these lichens. It's not normally that common to see it this bad, but it is important to be aware that you can see mosses on many trees, including hazelnuts. So these species do not attack the tree. They are not pathogens of the trees, but they can absorb moisture and increase limb weight. So where you have a real load of these things, such as in this photo with the lichen, there is the possibility that that increased limb weight can predispose the tree to breakage, which can then create wounds, which can cause some problems. But overall in hazelnuts, they're not usually found to be a problem in orchards that have good pruning techniques and that have regular bacterial blight sprays. So something you will see on your trees, but probably not something that you're going to have to control. With the next couple of slides, I'm going to touch on some decay fungi that we see on hazelnuts in Ontario. So as the name implies, these are not primary pathogens. These are fungi that tend to go on decaying bark. So they enter wounds that are caused by pruning, winter injury, or as secondary invaders colonizing trees already damaged by other pests. So where in Ontario, where we have young hazelnut orchards, where we see decay fungi is mainly on trees that are dying of Eastern Filbert blight, of bacterial disease, or from abiotic stress. It's particularly in orchards where grow tubes have been left on for too long and you have a really wet environment around the bark under those grow tubes. You can get some decay and you can see these decay fungi. So in this particular slide, I am showing you the decay fungus Encilia furfuraceae, and it's also called the spring hazelcat because it is actually a known colonizer of dying or freshly dead hazelnut. And in Ontario, where we found it so far is very commonly near bacterial blight lesions. So the spore-bearing structures of this fungi will emerge through the bark as these rough cups that are vaguely brain-like in appearance. They're initially brown, but they become white as they age. Again, these are not primary pathogens. They are associated with a bacterial blight or other infection. Another common decay fungi is Nectria, which will attack a number of fruit trees, not just hazelnuts, but it has a fairly distinctive structure, so it's quite noticeable. Initially, Nectria will make a sunken canker, but it's its fruiting structures that are really distinctive. They produce these initially creamy white, but initially bright reddish orange fruiting bodies that occur in rows along along the cankers in the tree. So it typically grows as a saprophyte on dead or dying wood. So in hazelnuts, again, in association with trees that have died of Filbert blight, are dying of bacterial blight, or in grow tubes, again, that have been left on too long. But if the plant is weakened or stressed, Nectria can become a weak pathogen. So it is best to prune out the infected area if you do see Nectria on your tree. One final decay fungi, which has not been seen in Ontario, but I do want to mention it because of its resemblance to Eastern Filbert blight, is one that has been reported in Oregon. It's Utipella cerviculara. The reason I want to mention it is because it produces black stromata that may make you think of Eastern Filbert blight fungus. So you can see a photo here on this tree. But the difference is that it is produced on already dead limbs. So it is not a pathogen, unlike the Eastern Filbert blight fungus. But you may initially, if you're out there looking for black stromata, think you're dealing with Eastern Filbert blight. So one way that the pathologists in Oregon have found to distinguish it from Eastern Filbert blight is by peeling back the bark, and you will see these sort of black rings on the undersurface of the stromata, and that distinguish it from Eastern Filbert blight. But this is not common in Ontario. We have never seen it here, but just mentioning it in the event that you do come across it because of its resemblance to Eastern Filbert blight disease. Finally, moving away from all those secondary pathogens to hazelnut early dying, which is more of a phenomenon that we have seen in some young hazelnut orchards. We first observed it in 2018 in Ontario hazelnut orchards, and it occurs on the main trunk of young hazelnuts. So that's trees no more than 3 years old, typically about a year old, and suddenly the main trunk will just die very, very rapidly. But the associated suckers often appear healthy. So we don't really know the cause. Some hypotheses are disease. That's sort of the primary thing that people assume, or herbicide damage, weakening of the bark due to the presence of grow tube, moisture stress, or other production practices. So in 2019, we did conduct an initial survey of Ontario hazelnut orchards. This was done by a student just to look at the prevalence of early dying. These were the results of that survey from 2019. We found an average incidence of about 4.5% of trees per orchard, but we did find some orchards with a higher prevalence, above 15%. And we never saw it in an orchard that was 5 years old or older. And there was no obvious single cause. So what we can say is it doesn't look like it is a particular pest or disease. It seems to be more related to production practices such as irrigation, potentially uneven planting depth, a little bit of herbicide damage. But we do need to do some further analysis. We had planned a survey for 2020 that we were unable to conduct due to restrictions related to the COVID outbreak. So we're hoping to do that again in 2021. But just mentioning that this is a common phenomenon that we see in young hazelnut orchards. And again, we don't think it's a pest or disease, although you should be scouting these affected trees for diseases. But just again, trying to keep growing conditions and your agronomic practices as ideal as possible for your hazelnut trees can help to prevent this. And that brings us to the end of the webinar on other diseases of hazelnuts. For further information, you can refer to other hazelnut-related publications that are currently or soon to be released on the OMAFRA website at www.ontario.ca/crops. More details on these can be found in part 1 of this webinar series. So thanks for listening to this webinar. I've included my contact information on this slide should you wish to reach out with any further questions or comments. And I also encourage you to subscribe to our specialty crops blog at onspecialtycrops.ca, which has timely updates on agronomics, pest management, and events affecting specialty crop producers in Ontario, including hazelnuts.